Okay, we'll start with the Mangalacharan. Andasya Jnanajanasalakaya Chachurmiltamena Svatantikam Vandeyam Sri Guru Sri Utapatakalam Sri Guru Vaishnavansha Sri Rupam Sagrajadam Sagana Raghunathan Vidam Sam Sajivam Sadvaitam Saudutam Paljana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lalita Sri Vishakan Vitam Sha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Deenabandhu Jagatpati Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namaste Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari वृषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये वंशकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्यः च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः श्रीकृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौरभक्तवृंद हरे कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे राम राम हरे 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 कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे राम राम हरे हरे ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेव uh, Hare Krishna. So today we will continue with chapter 2 from Hare Krishna. So today we will continue with chapter 2 from this small book, Beyond Birth and Death. So chapter 2 is titled Elevation at Death. In chapter 1, it was titled We Are Not These Bodies. It was mostly focused on the topic of self-realization, about how we actually begin our journey towards self-realization when we start to realize that we are not the material body but the spirit soul. So in short, self-realization can be summarized as realizing the self, meaning that we realize the self to be the spirit soul and not the material body. However, it should culminate in understanding the origin of the spirit soul itself. So once we understand that we are not the material body and that we are the spirit soul, so the next question which arises is regarding the origin of the spirit soul. So even regarding that, Lord Krishna has made it very clear in Gita 15.7, where he says, Mama Yanshu Jivaloke Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. All the spirit souls are the eternal fragmental parts of self. So regarding the expansions of the Supreme Lord, there are primary expansions, of which the Vishnu Tattvas and the various avatars uh, uh, emanate from, and the secondary expansions or the separated expansions are that of the living entities. So since we, the Jiva Tattvas, are the secondary expansions, so our status is that of uh, servitorship. So we are meant to be servants of the Supreme Lord. So the uh, the proper understanding about self-realization is that it first starts with understanding that we are not this material body, we are spirit souls, and since we are the eternal fragmental parts of the Supreme Lord, and we are this separated expansions of the Supreme Lord, hence we are meant to be servants of the Supreme Lord. So with this proper understanding, we can liberate ourselves from this material bondage and regain our eternal association with the Supreme Lord in the spiritual world and be engaged in his in devotional service towards him. So in this chapter, it is related to how we can elevate ourselves during the time of death. So there is one particular chapter in the Bhagavad Gita itself, chapter 8, titled Attaining the Supreme. So the chapter itself starts with Arjuna's inquiry. So in the first verse of chapter 8 of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna starts his inquiry by asking, what is Brahman? What is the self? What are fruitive activities? What is this material manifestation? And what are the demigods? Please explain this to me. Who is the Lord of sacrifice and how does he live in the body? O Madhusudana. And how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death? So this chapter 8 from Bhagavad Gita, titled Attaining the Supreme, it uh, it is meant to answer these specific questions. So similarly, we can also see that in chapter 13 also, the chapter starts with Arjuna's inquiries. In chapter 13, Arjuna asks about 6 subject matters: Prakriti Purusha, uh, Prakriti Purusha, Kshetra Kshetrajna, Jnanam Nyayam. So even in that chapter, the chapter starts with a set of questions, and the uh, core content of the chapter is meant to answer those questions. So similarly, in chapter 8 also, the chapter starts with specific questions from Arjuna, and one of the important questions which he asks is regarding how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death. If you look at the first 6 aspects about which Arjuna is inquiring, what is Brahman, what is the self, what are fruitive activities, what is this material manifestation, and what are the demigods, who is the Lord of sacrifice, Adi Yajna. So these are actually like continuation from the end of chapter 7. So the terms like Adi Yajna, Adi Deva, Adi Bhuta, so these were mentioned in chapters towards the end of chapter 7. So Arjuna asks regarding those specific keywords, and a very important part of his query is regarding how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death. So the Supreme Lord, he explains regarding the 6 specific queries of Arjuna, and then he also proceeds to answer regarding how those engaged in devotional service can know about the Supreme Lord at the time of death. So that even the answer for that question is given in the 5th verse, and the subsequent verses are also related to this particular area about how remembrance about the Supreme Lord can lead us to being elevated to the spiritual world. So in this small book titled Beyond Birth and Death, this chapter 2 is specifically related to this topic about how those who are engaged in devotional service get elevated to the spiritual world. There are different kinds of transcendentalists who are called yogis: Hatha yogis, Jnana yogis, Dhyana yogis, and Bhakti yogis. And all of them are eligible to be transferred to the spiritual world. Okay, what is the difference between Hatha yogi and Dhyana yogi? There's also this term called Ashtanga yoga. So what is the difference between all these? Hatha yoga, Dhyana yoga, Ashtanga yoga. So in Ashtanga yoga, it is an 8-fold process. So the first 4 processes, they are related to the physical aspects. So if you look at the first 4, they are more related to the physical activities, followed by the second half, in which the remaining 4 steps are related to controlling the mind and senses. So Hatha Yoga is more related to the physical aspects, the physical activities, and Dhyana Yoga covers the second half of the Ashtanga Yoga system. But Hatha Yoga and Dhyana Yoga put together, they form the Ashtanga Yoga system. The word yoga means to link up, and the yoga systems are meant to enable us to link with the transcendental world. As mentioned in the previous chapter, originally we are all connected to the Supreme Lord, but now we have been affected by material contamination. The process is that we have to return to the spiritual world, and that process of linking up is called yoga. Another meaning of the word yoga is plus. At the present moment, we are minus God or minus the Supreme. When we add Krishna or God to our lives, this human form of life becomes perfect. So the word yoga itself, it has a very in-depth meaning, though it may appear to be simple, but there's a very uh, elaborate significance to it. Even in the Bhagavad Gita itself, all the 18 chapters, they are titled with the term yoga. So the first chapter is titled Arjuna Vishada Yoga or Sainya Darshana Yoga. The second chapter is titled Sankhya Yoga. Third chapter Karma Yoga. So similarly, all the chapters up to chapter 18 is also titled Moksha Sannyasa Yoga. So there is also a significance in this, because if we look at the entire discourse of the Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 1, Arjuna arrives at the battlefield of Kurukshetra with his cousin, Lord Krishna. But during that point of time, before the actual discourse starts, Arjuna was still in this mood of being a friend or a cousin to the Supreme Lord. But as we know, in chapter 11, after witnessing the Vishwarupa Darshan, Arjuna's mood changes to the mood of a devotee, and also first he's wonderstruck, and then he completely turns into the mood of a devotee from being from initially being in the mood of a friend and a cousin. So initially when he arrives, as we know in chapter 1, he is very reluctant to fight against his relatives, the Kauravas. So he's reluctant to kill his grandfather and his guru. So he became somewhat detached from his dharma. And after listening to the entire discourse of the Bhagavad Gita, after being enlightened by the transcendental teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, after hearing it from the Supreme Lord, he becomes attached to his dharma. So he agrees to act according to the instructions of the Supreme Lord when he says Karishye Vachanam Tava in 18.73. So at that point, from being detached from doing his dharma, he listens to the instructions of the Supreme Lord, and he surrenders to Supreme Lord, and he says Karishye Vachanam Tava. So at that point, he becomes linked up again with the Supreme Lord. So we are also in a similar situation where we, due to our material contamination, we ended up in this material world, and by enlightening ourselves with proper spiritual knowledge, we can also get linked up with the Supreme Lord. So that is what Srila Prabhupada has also mentioned here. At the present moment, we are minus God or minus the Supreme. So Arjuna was also in a similar condition in chapter 1 when he was in that state of bewilderment. So when he was enlightened with the knowledge of the Bhagavad Gita, then it turned into a plus. So when we add Krishna or God to our lives, this human form of life becomes perfect. Without it, this human form of life is completely useless, because the very purpose of this human form of life is to engage in spiritual inquiry, which should culminate in devotional service. Otherwise, we are only going to live like cats and dogs and waste this precious opportunity. At the time of death, we have to finish that process of perfection. During our lifetime, we have to practice the method of approaching that perfection, so that at the time of death, when we have to give up this material body, that perfection can be realized. So what is that perfection? It is to first realize ourselves, and also to realize our constitutional position as eternal servants of the Supreme Lord. So if the human form of life is not dedicated towards this cause, so we are only living like cats and dogs and being engaged in the business of eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. Without spiritual inquiry and devotional service, there's no difference between us and the animals. So if we do not consider this human form of life as the perfect opportunity to attain perfection, then we do not deserve this opportunity. So this rare opportunity, we have attained it after after transmigrating between the 84 lakh species of material bodies, and due to the mercy of the Supreme Lord, we have attained this rare opportunity, which is also very short in terms of the time duration, especially in this Kali Yuga. So if we do not attain perfection in this with this rare opportunity, then it is completely unlikely that we are going to attain perfection from the body of some other degraded species. So how can we attain perfection? Simply by following the instructions of the Supreme Lord, and also the instructions of our acharyas. So in Gita 8.10, the Supreme Lord says, Prayana kale manasachalena bhaktya yukto yoga balena saiva ruor matye pranama avesha samyak satam param purusham upaiti divyam. One who at the time of death fixes his life air between the eyebrows and in full devotion engages himself in remembering the Supreme Lord will certainly attain to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So as mentioned earlier, in chapter 8, Arjuna starts with his specific questions, and the last question of Arjuna in chapter 8 is regarding how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death. So the Supreme Lord answers all the 6 aspects in verses 3 and 4. Then starting from verse 5, the Supreme Lord starts to explain specifically regarding how those who are engaged in devotional service can attain him at the time of death. So this important verse 8.5, Antakale chamameva smaran muktva kalevaram yaprayati samadbhavam yati nashtyatra samshayaha. And whoever at the end of his life quits his body remembering me alone at once attains my nature. Of this there is no doubt. So in this verse, the Supreme Lord says that those who remember him at the time of death can attain the spiritual world. Of this there is no doubt. However, it is extremely unfortunate that even many devotees do not understand the true meaning behind this, since the Supreme Lord had said that those who remember him at the time of death can attain him. So a lot of people, they tend to misunderstand that it is okay to be engaged in all sorts of nonsense throughout our life and just uh, try to remember Krishna at the time of death. So that is just not possible if we do not practice to remember the Supreme Lord throughout our life, throughout our lifetime. It is impossible for us to remember him at the time of death. So this fifth verse, verse 8.5, should not be read in isolation. It is related to all the subsequent verses, especially verses 6, 7, and 8. So in 8.5, the Supreme Lord answers the specific question of Arjuna. In 8.2, Arjuna asks, how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death? So the specific answer for that is in 8.5. So the Supreme Lord says, and whoever at the end of his life, which his body remembering me alone, at once attains my nature. Of this, there's no doubt. But this verse should not be read in isolation. It is related to all the subsequent verses, especially verse 6, 7, and 8. It is impossible for us to remember the Supreme Lord at the time of death if we do not practice remembering him throughout our lifetime. So that's why the Supreme Lord proceeds to speak the following verses also, like in 8.6. He says, whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, O son of Kunti, that state he will attain without fail. Yamemapi swanambhavam tjajitante kalevaram tam tamevaiti kaunteya sadatat bhava bhavitaha. 8.7. Therefore, Arjuna, you should always think of me in the form of Krishna and at the same time carry out your prescribed duty of fighting with your activities dedicated to me and your mind and intelligence fixed on me. You will attain me without doubt. He who meditates on me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his mind constantly engaged in remembering me, undeviated from the path, he, O Partha, is sure to reach me. So, uh, the misconception among a lot of people is that just because the Supreme Lord says anyone who remembers him at the time of death can attain him, so it is not that we just have to try to remember him at the time of death and spend our entire lifetime by being engaged in all sorts of nonsense. So to dispel that misconception, the Supreme Lord has had also mentioned in 8.7, therefore, Arjuna, you should always think of me in the form of Krishna. So in this verse, he says, Tasmat sarveshu kaleshu mam anusmara yudhyacha mai arpita manobuddhir mame vaishasya samshaya. Tasmat sarveshu kaleshu. Always remember me. So we can only remember the Supreme Lord at the time of death, only if we remember him throughout our lifetime. We have to practice remembering him throughout our lifetime, and the best way to do it is by being engaged in the Navaveda Bhakti process. However, though there are 9 processes in the Navaveda Bhakti, still it doesn't mean that we have to perform all 9. In many of Srila Prabhupada's purports, he has highlighted that even one who performs, for anyone who performs even one of the 9 processes, such a person can attain perfection. For example, the verse about the Navaveda Bhakti from Srimad Bhagavatam 7.5.23. Shravanam Kirtanam Vishnu Smaranam Padasevanam Archana Vandanam Dasyam Sakyam Atmanivedam. So the first process, Shravanam. So it is actually the easiest process for us to listen to Kirtan, to Krishna Katha. So it is the easiest process. Another good example of the one who attained perfection through Shravanam is, who was it? The person who attained perfection through Shravanam? Parikshit Maharaj. Then Shukadeva Goswami attained perfection through Kirtanam. Similarly, there are many exalted devotees who attain perfection through each of the Navida Bhakti processes. So, we can remember the Supreme Lord at the time of death if we practice remembering Him throughout our lifetime. So, our Acharyas, not just our Acharyas, it is actually part of the scriptural injunctions, especially for this Kali Yuga. Apart from the verse which goes Hare Nama, Hare Nama, Hare Nama Kevalam, Kalau Nastiyeva, Nastiyeva, Nastiyeva Gatiranyata. So this is one verse which talks about how Harinam alone is the only method for liberation in Kali Yuga. Even in the entire discourse of Srimad Bhagavatam, there are 18,000 verses. So we know that in the first chapter of Bhagavatam, the discourse starts with the conversation between the sages at Naimisharanya. So they were anxious to know about what type of process is required for liberation of the Kali Jivas. So the discourse of Bhagavatam starts with this inquiry, and if we look at the last verse of Bhagavatam in the 12th canto, 12, 13, 23, the verse glorifies Harinam. So the purpose behind the discourse of the Bhagavatam starts to find out the perfect method for liberation in Kali Yuga, and the last verse concludes with the verdict that chanting the holy name is the best method for liberation. So even as we chant, we are actually performing two types of the 2 out of the 9 processes. So when we chant, we are actually chanting and we are also listening. Of course, this is only possible when we chant attentively. So we have to listen to every word and every syllable as we chant, not to simply chant, but also to listen. So then the process becomes effective. So apart from Shravanam and Kirtanam, other processes like Archanam, Vandanam, they require more preparation and more paraphernalia. So those facilities may not always be available to us. So as long as we sincerely endeavor to improve our chanting, so that alone is good enough for us to train ourselves so that we can remember the Supreme Lord throughout our lifetime, and by His mercy, we'll also be able to remember Him at the time of death. So those who read the 5th verse from the 8th chapter of the Gita, this verse is not meant to be read in isolation. It should be read together with all the subsequent verses. So starting from 8.5, the Supreme Lord actually gave a straightforward answer to the question by Arjuna about how one can remember the Supreme Lord at the time of death. Then he proceeds to elaborate about what are the processes required to attain to that state of being able to remember him at the time of death. So as we saw earlier in 8.10, the Supreme Lord says, one who at the time of death fixes his life air between the eyebrows and by the strength of yoga with an undeviating mind, engages himself in remembering the Supreme Lord in full devotion, will certainly attain to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So it is also mentioned in 8.8 that he who meditates on me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his mind constantly engaged in remembering me, undeviated from the path, he, O Partha, is sure to reach me. So the most important thing to be observed here is that we have to be seriously engaged in the practice of Krishna consciousness. We can only be able to remember the Supreme Lord at the time of death if we remain engaged in the practice throughout our lives. Just as a student studies a subject for 4 or 5 years and then takes his examination and receives a degree. Similarly, with the subject of life, if we practice during our lives for the examination at the time of death, and if we pass the examination, we are transferred to the spiritual world. Our whole life is examined at the time of death. So as mentioned earlier, the only way to attain perfection in this human form of life is to practice Krishna consciousness, because without devotional service, our human life is worthless, because when the human life is devoid of spiritual inquiry and devotional service, it is no better than the life of cats and dogs. So those who are engaged in devotional service, they will be able to pass the exam at the time of death. Otherwise, those who do not care about liberating themselves from this material bondage, for those who think that spiritual life is a waste of time, for those who think that material opulence is everything, so they are also free to do as they wish. In the Bhagavad Gita, the Supreme Lord, he actually spoke more than 500 verses. He patiently answered all of Arjuna's questions, but in verse 18.63, verse 63 from chapter 18, he says, Yata ichasi tata kuru. He patiently answered all the questions of Arjuna, but towards the end, he leaves it to Arjuna to make his choice. So similarly, all the living entities have the minute freedom to do whatever they want. So we have been transmigrating over lakhs, the 84 lakhs of material bodies, mainly due to our foolishness. So the Supreme Lord was only accommodating us to enjoy ourselves as we wanted. We are the ones who wanted to enjoy in this material world, and therefore the Supreme Lord created the 84 lakh species of material bodies, or the 84 lakh apartments for the spirit soul to reside and enjoy material sense gratification. But now that we have attained this human form of life, if we do not understand the purpose behind this human form of life, if we waste this wonderful opportunity, then we are only going to get degraded to the lower species. So that is what the Supreme Lord says in 8.6. So this is, again, this verse, it is also completely related to our own individual freedom. So in 8.6, the Supreme Lord says, Yam yavapi swaran bhavan, chadityanti kalevaram, tam tam eviti kaunteya, sadatat bhava bhavitaha. Whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, that state he will attain without fail. So this verse indicates that we, the Jiva Tattvas, we all have our minute freedom to decide our next destination. Now we have attained this human form of life because our past activities have been favorable enough for us to attain this exalted position. But if we do not fully utilize this wonderful opportunity, then we are going to end up in a further degraded species of material body. From here, from this human form of life, our goal should be to regain our original transcendental body in the spiritual world. So for those who are sincerely endeavoring and for those who are sincerely endeavoring to be engaged in Krishna consciousness, they will be absorbed in the practice and always remember the Supreme Lord. So for them, they can easily attain the spiritual world because naturally the remembrance of the Supreme Lord will come at the time of death. But for those who are completely absorbed in the temptations of material sense gratification and material opulence, for them, all the 14 planetary systems are there for them to enjoy material sense gratification. However, it is in this very same chapter, in chapter 8 of the Bhagavad Gita, the Supreme Lord also says that this entire material universe is Dukkalayam Ashashvatam. So, it is entirely up to the individual living entities to decide what they want to do with this wonderful opportunity, whether they want to liberate themselves from this Dukkalayam or whether they want to continue enjoying in this Dukkalayam. It is entirely up to them. There is a Bengali proverb that says that whatever one does for perfection will be tested at the time of his death. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna describes what one should do when giving up the body. For the Jnana Yogi meditator, Sri Krishna speaks the following verses. Yad aksharam veda vido vadanti vishanti yad yatayo vitaragaha yad ichanto brahmacharyam charanti tatte padam sangrahena pravakshe sarvadvarani samyaya manohridi nurudyacha mudni adhyatmanah pranam ashito yoga dharanam. Persons learn in the Vedas who utter Omkara and who are great sages in the renounced order enter into Brahman, desiring such perfection. One practices celibacy. I shall now explain to you this process by which one may attain salvation. The yogic situation is that of detachment from all sensual engagements, closing all the doors of the senses and fixing the mind on the heart and the life air. At the top of the head, one establishes himself in yoga. Gita 8.11, 8.12. In the yoga system, this process is called pratyahara, which means just the opposite. Although during life, the eyes are engaged in seeing worldly beauty, at death, one has to retract the senses from their objects and see the beauty within. Similarly, the ears are accustomed to hearing so many sounds in the world, but at the moment of death, one has to hear the transcendental Omkara from within. Omiti eka aksharam brahma vyaharan mam anusmaran ya prayati yadan deham sayati paramam gatim. After being situated in this yoga practice and vibrating the sacred syllable Om, the supreme combination of letters, if one thinks of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and quits his body, he will certainly reach the spiritual planets. Gita 8.13. In this way, all the senses have to be stopped in their external activities and concentrated on the form of Vishnumurti, the form of God. The mind is very turbulent, but it has to be fixed on the Lord in the heart. When the mind is fixed within the heart and the life air is transferred to the top of the head, one can attain perfection in yoga. So if we simply observe these processes step by step, it is actually clearly it is not meant for us, simply because even in chapter 6, Arjuna himself, such an exalted devotee of the Supreme Lord, who was he himself was living in Dwapara Yuga. So even he himself, when Lord Krishna was explaining about the Dhyana Yoga process, he himself complained about the nature of the mind, which is very difficult to control. So if we look at this entire yogic process, which revolves around Dhyana Yoga and meditation, so it is impossible for Kali Jivas to be engaged in this process, and therefore the best way is to be engaged in devotional service, where we can still keep all our senses engaged. So since the mind and our senses are always very likely to be running after sense objects. So the best way is not to merely withdraw from everything, but based on the instructions of our acharyas, we can engage them in devotional service. So that is actually much more simpler compared to this meditative yogic process. At this point, the yogi determines where he is to go in the material universe. There are innumerable planets, and beyond this universe, there is the spiritual universe. The yogis have information of these places from Vedic literatures, just as one going to America can get some idea what the country is like by reading books. One can also have knowledge of the spiritual planets by reading Vedic literatures. The yogi knows all these disciplines and he can transfer himself to any planet he likes without the help of spaceships. Space travel by mechanical means is not the accepted process for elevation to other planets. Perhaps with a great deal of time, effort, and money, a few men may be able to reach other planets by material means, spaceships, spacesuits, etc. But this is a very cumbersome and impractical method. In any case, it is not possible to go beyond the material universe by mechanical means. So, this material universe, based on the Vedic or Bhagavata cosmology itself, it is mainly divided into three divisions: the upper, middle, and lower divisions, consisting of the 14 planetary systems. So, even with the so-called scientific advancement, we can only travel from one planet to another, still within this material universe. But the only solution to all our problems in this Dukkalayam is to completely liberate ourselves from this material universe and attain the spiritual world. So even the so-called scientific advancements, even if they actually become so advanced to the point of traveling to all the other planets, still it will still be within the same material universe. And of course, it would be extremely ironic for the so-called scientists to focus on those missions when the questions regarding the permanent solutions to the problems of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi remain unanswered despite all these so-called scientific advancements. Despite whatever these scientists are claiming to have achieved, they still have no answers about how we can liberate ourselves from the problems of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi. The generally accepted method for transfer to higher planets is the practice of the meditational yoga system or jnana system. The bhakti yoga system, however, is not to be practiced for transfer to any material planet. For those who are servants of Krishna, the Supreme Lord, are not interested in any planets in this material world, because they know that on whatever planet one enters in the material sky, the four principles of birth, old age, disease, and death are present. So as we saw in the previous paragraphs regarding the meditative yoga process, not only the process is so impractical for us, the Kali Jivas, it is also completely not worth to be pursued, simply because it only leads us to higher planets, but still within the same material universe. So it does not promise any permanent solutions to our eternal problems of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi in this material world. But Bhakti Yoga offers the permanent solutions to these problems, because it focuses on how we can elevate ourselves completely from this material world to the spiritual world. So for the meditative yogis who are obsessed in that process, so still they are they are only putting themselves to so much trouble for nothing, because simply by transferring oneself from one planet to another within the same material universe is not going to solve any problem. We can only solve our problems if we elevate ourselves from this material universe to the spiritual world, and that is possible only through Bhakti Yoga. That is why even in chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita, the chapter itself is titled Dhyana Yoga, but the last verse of chapter 6 in Gita 6.47, the Supreme Lord says, Yoginam api sarvesham madgatinam taratmana shraddhavan bhajati yomam samyuktamo matah. The topmost yogi is the Bhakti Yogi. So though the title of chapter 6 is Dhyana Yoga, but the verdict of the chapter in the last verse is that Bhakti Yoga is the topmost yoga system, because only Bhakti Yoga provides us with the answers about how we can liberate ourselves from the problems of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi. So that is possible only by elevating ourselves to the spiritual world. All other meditative yoga processes can only enable us to travel from one planet to another within the same material universe, which is full of the same problems of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi, even up to the topmost planet in Satyaloka, which is the abode of Lord Brahma. On higher planets, the duration of life may be longer than on this earth, but death is there nonetheless. So even in Satyaloka, the abode of Lord Brahma, his total duration of his lifetime is much longer than us. It is according to his calendar, when compared to our earthly years, Lord Brahma lives up to 300, about 300 trillion years. But still, even after that period of time, even Lord Brahma has to die. Even he is not immune from the problems of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi. So only by being engaged in Bhakti Yoga, we can completely liberate ourselves from these problems. So the so-called modern science has got no answers to these fundamental questions. By material universe, we refer to those planets where birth, old age, disease, and death reside. And by spiritual universe, we refer to those planets where there is no birth, old age, disease, and death. Those who are intelligent do not try to elevate themselves to any planet within the material universe. As mentioned earlier, it has also been mentioned in the 7th canto of Bhagavatam in the teachings of Prahlad Maharaj. It is stated that this human form of life is very rare. Though it is temporary, it can be made very meaningful. So, it is especially true for us, the Kali Jivas, because we have so much limited time. We don't even have 100 years. And it is also stated in the 12th canto of Bhagavatam, in the chapter titled Symptoms of Kali Yuga, that as Kali Yuga advances, the total duration of life will become 50 years. So as Kali Yuga advances, it will become even more difficult for people to cross the age of 50. And we are already seeing those symptoms now itself. So that's why it is extremely important that we understand these intricate details related to the ideal yoga system. So only Bhakti Yoga focuses on how we can elevate ourselves from this material world to the spiritual world, so that we can completely liberate ourselves from the problems of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi. Otherwise, we are only going to end up wasting our time on all the other lesser important yoga systems, which do not really provide any benefits to us. So only Bhakti Yoga enables us to completely solve the problems of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi by regaining our original constitutional position in the spiritual world. So those who are intelligent do not try to elevate themselves to any planet within the material universe, especially with the limited amount of time that we have. If one tries to enter higher planets by mechanical means, instant death is assured, for the body cannot stand the radical changes in atmosphere. But if one attempts to go to higher planets by means of the yoga system, he will acquire a suitable body for entrance. We can see this demonstrated on this earth, for we know it is not possible for us to live in the sea in a watery atmosphere, nor is it possible for aquatics to live on earth. As we understand that even on this planet, one has to have a particular type of body to live in a particular place. So a particular type of body is required for other planets. On the higher planets, bodies live much longer than on Earth. For 6 months on Earth is equal to 1 day on the higher planets. Thus, the Vedas describe that those who live on higher planets live upward to 10,000 Earth years. Yet, despite such a long lifespan, death awaits everyone. So, Lord Krishna also mentions regarding this in Gita 8.16 onwards. Brahma Bhuvana Loka. So, he explains regarding how even the topmost planet in this material universe, Satyaloka, the abode of Lord Brahma, even that part of the material universe is not free from the problems of birth, death, old age, and disease. Even Lord Brahma has to die. So it is not worth wasting our life by experimenting with all the different yoga systems. It is best if we simply follow the instructions of our acharyas and be completely absorbed in the process of bhakti yoga, because that is exactly what even the Supreme Lord himself has prescribed in chapter 14 of the Gita. In chapter 14, it is about the topic on the three modes of material nature. So in that chapter, there are 27 verses. So the main portion of the chapter covers regarding the three modes of material nature related to various aspects which are covered according to the three modes. But towards the end, the Supreme Lord mentions that as long as one remains a conditioned soul in this material world, he will always be subservient to the three modes. So one can only attain the spiritual world by transcending the modes. So how can we do that? The Supreme Lord specifically mentions in Gita 14.26, the second last verse of chapter 14. The Supreme Lord says, Mam chayo avyabhicharena bhakti yogena sevate sagunan samati jaitan brahmo bhuyaya kalpate. So the key word in the verse, in the exact verse spoken by the Supreme Lord, Mam chayo avyabhicharena bhakti yogena sevate. So the Supreme Lord did not say karma yogena sevate, jnana yogena sevate, or dhyana yogena sevate. He himself specifically mentions bhakti yogena sevate. So according to Supreme Lord, we can transcend the three modes by being engaged in bhakti yoga. So that is what he himself specifically prescribes, and our acharyas have also explained about how we can be engaged and be completely absorbed in the process of bhakti yoga. And therefore, with the limited amount of time we have, we simply have to follow the instructions of the Supreme Lord. Thus, the Vedas describe that those who live on higher planets live upward to 10,000 Earth years. Yet, despite such a long lifespan, death awaits everyone. Even if one lives 20,000 or 50,000 or even millions of years in the material world, the years are all counted and death is there. How can we escape this subjugation by death? That is the lesson of the Bhagavad Gita. So only by practicing Bhakti Yoga, we can completely find a permanent solution to this problem of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi, which is causing us to transmigrate between the various material bodies. So we'll continue in the next session. Thank you. Any questions or comments?
Everything okay, Prabhu.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhu.